So the person who's going to come to the microphone after me came to MIT in the 50s after a few years at Harvard. At MIT, specifically in the Department of Modern Languages, he started what turned out to be a lifelong friendship and collaboration with a colleague, a collaboration which resulted, among many other things, in the publication of a book called The Sound Patterns of English. And of course, it's this collaboration that also brought about the establishment of MIT's program in linguistics, the 50 years of which we are celebrating today. It is impossible to put into words the influence of this person's mark on the field, so I won't even try. Many of us in this room were his students, others were his students' students, or his students' students' students, and so on. This will continue for a long time still. After almost 60 years at MIT, this person still comes to the department regularly, and I know this because his office is down the hall from mine. And it's always a pleasure to bump into him in the corridor and exchange a few or many words with him, as, you know, depending on the day. So life has been a long and marvelous journey for this person, and we've been all extremely lucky to witness part of it. It has been a journey full of wondrous ideas, discoveries, and insights, a journey of teaching and, as he himself says, of being taught. A journey that has included many people, many students, a lot of adventures, a lot of things happening. A journey that started several decades ago in this person's hometown in Latvia. Now you're confused, and you're appropriately confused, because you are assuming that I'm introducing the next speaker. I am not introducing the next speaker. I'm introducing the person who's going to introduce the next speaker, Morris.
Thank you very much. The task that I was assigned by Sabine Yatridou and that I'm now executing is to introduce the speaker of the evening. Since Noam Chomsky has been a figure of great importance in linguistics for the last half century, there's nobody here who hasn't read his work. There's nobody here who hasn't been deeply influenced by it. It is a great honor and a great pleasure to introduce my old department colleague and friend, Noam Chomsky, who will now speak.
You've all been through a long, hard day, and I thought that instead of another technical talk on current work, it might be more useful just to, for this occasion at least, to remember what we're here for, 50th anniversary of the department, and to make some personal reflections on what the circumstances were like in the days when the department was being planned, and what it's like today. There are several aspects to this. One of them is what's happened internally to the field. Second is what are the relations to the general scientific, intellectual context in which the field finds, or I think should find, its place. The earlier part is really not ancient history, because I think a lot of the issues that were alive in the 50s are still very much alive, and in some ways I think there's even been regression. I'll keep here to what René Huybrechts and Henk van Riemsdyk called the generative enterprise. It's developed in many directions. It's by no means uncontested, even within the field, certainly outside it. And it's unnecessary to say that what I'll be giving is a personal perspective. I'm not going to try to convince anyone of anything, but simply talk about the way these things look to me. Well, there have been vast changes as far as Morris and I are personally concerned. For example, when we met back in probably 1951, I guess, neither of us ever expected that we'd end up in the academic world. At least I certainly didn't. And certainly that we wouldn't have any opportunity to form a department, let alone a flourishing department. So that's a pretty significant change, personally. Internal to the field, of course, changes have been enormous. The kinds of questions that you're talking about today couldn't even be formulated, let alone pursued back in the 1950s, which is a pretty significant and in many ways quite remarkable fact, because the topics that were alive then, say when we were students, would have been perfectly intelligible to earlier generations of linguists. In fact, going back millennia, there were changes, but slight. The changes since have been astronomical, and that's quite significant. Should be borne in mind. Another difference is that the people who were engaged in the generative enterprise 50 years ago, 60 years ago, were so few that my own personal reflections have a degree of credibility, qualifying for the effects of age, but which is certainly not true today with the vastly richer and much more differentiated growth even within the generative enterprise, let alone outside it. So I'll say what I think, but it's can't have the kind of credibility that it does with regard to the 1950s when there were 2 or 3 of us. One fundamental and far-reaching change, and another very significant one, is that today no one doubts that there are serious problems in the field, which is a change. At the time of the formation of the department in the 1950s, it was quite different. Not only was it generally assumed that there are no serious problems in the field, but there were principled reasons to believe that there couldn't be any. That's actually quite true. I can remember when I was a student back in the late 40s at the most sophisticated, advanced theoretical linguistics program in the country, the students felt stuff is kind of fun, but what will happen when we've given a structural description of every language using the methods that were taught? It'll be over. It's a terminating field. Maybe you can tweak the methods a little if you're more theoretical bent, or you can look for more data, but there's essentially nothing more to do. And that was pretty widely believed. So, for example, there was one famous linguist, won't mention his name, in the mid-50s who simply announced that he was not going to do any more work. And he explained why. He said, computers are coming along, pretty soon they'll be available. We know the methods that we're supposed to use to analyze data, so the only thing to do is just collect more data. He happened to be an American Indian linguist, and the field was pretty much inside anthropological linguistics at the time, but that was not an unreasonable position. Linguistic theory meant a set of methods of analysis. The main theoretical text was Zelig-Harris's book, Methods in Structural Linguistics, and you may recall that the first edition of it, not the later ones, was called Methods in Structural Linguistics, which is correct because it was an account of the methods that can be applied to reduce data to some organized form. And furthermore, there was no right answer to how to do it. In fact, the concept of a right answer was sort of ridiculed. The famous linguist Fred Householder once dismissed with ridicule what he called God's truth linguistics, the kind of linguistic work by various mystics who think that there's something real to discover, whereas in fact all there is modes of analysis. Good reaction to Harris's book when it came out was the field, remember, was mostly in anthropology at the time, and there was a review in I guess it was an American Anthropologist by a well-known structural linguist, Stanley Newman, who said that the book defines the course of the most promising methods employed during the past generation and projects an inevitable curve into the future. So it follows that there really can't be any problems about language other than identifying units, maybe tweaking the methods, and applying them. The methods were basically two: segmentation and classification. Those of you who follow computational cognitive science today will be aware that we're back there, in many ways worse, I think. I'll talk about that later. Classification is based on distribution of elements within a corpus, and the concept of a corpus was something that you elicit by intervention from an informant. So you don't just, I mean, if you have nothing else, you take a text, but the idea was you're taught how to do informant work through elicitation techniques, ask the right questions, see if you can get answers that will enable you to segment and classify properly. There was a related point of view on the possible variation of language. It was called sometimes the Boasian tradition, after Frank Boas. Whether that's actually fair to him or not is another question. But the Boasian tradition held that languages can vary in arbitrary ways, and that it's a methodological error when you approach a new language to approach it with any preconceptions, because it could be anything. That happened to be Martin Joseph's formulation, but widely held. Well, there was also no need for any clear conception of language, and there wasn't any. The grand old man of American linguistics at the time was Leonard Bloomfield. For him, a language is the totality of utterances made in a speech community. And again, that's typically understood to mean a corpus that a linguist could elicit by working with an informant. Hockett, one of the leading theoretical linguists in 1958, described syntax as the study of the ways in which words and supersegmental morphemes, prosodic elements, term of the time, the ways in which they're arranged relative to each other. And the term arranged relative to each other, again, meant in some kind of corpus that you could elicit. Many years later, in 1986, Joseph Greenberg was writing retrospectively about the field at that time, and when he was a student, he was a little bit older, and he pointed out accurately that all of contemporary American linguistics consisted of elaborate but essentially descriptive procedures. It's his reflections on being a linguistic anthropologist in the Annual Review of Anthropology in 1986. There were, of course, attempts at generalization. So in the late 50s, Greenberg, in fact, was beginning what became his quite significant work on linguistic universals, but he meant by that something different from what was meant by the emerging concept of universal grammar, UG. For Greenberg, quote him, generalization of linguistic universals, and this is the traditional view, were generalizations over historically independent cases of the phenomenon to be studied. It was a study of preferences and correlations to be explaining them, but they're to be explained largely on functionalist grounds, on grounds of psychological and social factors that enter into behavior. More recently, there's been very valuable work, which you all know, on trying to account for some of Greenberg's universals on the basis of a very different conception of UG, universal grammar. There were the most influential generalizations at the time have been mostly forgotten. I'd be surprised if many of you even know about them. So by far the most influential were Traeger and Smith's work on an overall pattern for English dialects. That is a general list of structure, not much structure, list basically of the possible phonemes that could appear in an English dialect. One of the crucial aspects of it was, in fact, prosody for pitches, for stresses. All you could do is annotate different dialects with these items. That was linguistics. Actually, European linguistics wasn't very different. If you look at, say, Trubetskoy's introduction to phonology, foundational work, it's essentially procedural, same kind of thing. There was, of course, interest in phonological features. Roman Jakobson was foremost in that domain, but you have to remember that his work was mostly dismissed in the United States, not just by linguists, but by engineers, people doing speech analysis and so on. Morris, I'm sure, will remember those speech analysis conferences in around 1950, which were pretty embarrassing, I think. But Jakobson himself was a strict phenomenalist. It was kind of a principle that you had to perceive the phonemic differences. Again, Morris and I'll remember a big effort we made to try to get him to consider the fact that in what were then topics of much significance, the contrast between words like, say, writer and rider, where the medial consonant is identical phonetically for the two, the vowel quality is different. But the phonemic difference, the significant difference is obviously in the consonant, even though you can't hear it there. We never succeeded, even with experimental work, because it just couldn't be. You had to perceive the phonemic differences. And there's a principle behind that, too, which is also based on the procedural approach to language. You can't mix levels. If you're doing serious procedural analysis, you get the smallest units first, and then classify them into bigger units, and then get sequence of these, and go to the next level, and so on. But to explain things like writer-rider, you have to take account of the pretty obvious fact that one of them's derived from right, the other from ride, and the phonemic difference is obvious, but that's illegitimate. You can't look at that for principled reasons. And there were people like, say, Bernard Bloch, who actually was very helpful to us, I should say, in the early days, me in particular. He was very honest about it. He never fudged. He was consistent. So, for example, he was a very important phonologist. For example, if it takes, say, words like cot and cod, cot that you lie on, codfish. For him, they had two phonemic differences. The consonants were different, and the vowels were different. They contrasted. And the reason they contrasted is because there's one pair in English in which they contrast, namely pod, P-O-D, as in, whatever, podcast, and pod, as in the sentence, pod do it if he had the time, but he didn't have the time. And in those two, the vowels differ, so therefore there's a phonemic distinction. So therefore, say, cot and cod have two phonemic differences. That was a principled approach. Actually, many people were kind of schizophrenic, and on the one hand, kept to the principles, at least when they were in their theoretical mood, giving analyses that were kind of like this, but in some other mood, when they were relying on their intuitions about language, did what made sense, even though it was inconsistent with the principles. Actually, the most famous case of this was, again, Bloomfield, was his work on ordered rules. In his classic text, the standard text language, he was dismissed with ridicule the idea that there could be ordered rules. That's mentalistic. You can't see it, so it doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, when he was doing his linguistic work, he was a very good scholar, in particular an Indic scholar. He knew the Indic tradition back to Panini, and he wrote, when he did his now famous, not then famous, Menominee Morphophonemics, he did it in the style of Panini and Indic grammar with ordered rules, even though that was inconsistent, not only inconsistent with his own theory, but it was an approach that he dismissed as absurd. He published that in Prague, and I've often been wondered whether he did that because he just didn't want it to be read around here. But I don't know. I should say that this was discovered by Tom Bever, mainly in the early 60s, who ended up doing his dissertation on it. But before that, it was essentially unknown. In fact, it's even missing from the standard bibliographies of Bloomfield's work on Algonquin linguistics by his students. Just to make another personal comment, in the late 40s, I was kind of trying to reinvent this. I didn't know it existed, but I was trying to do more phonemic analysis, and this seemed like the only sensible way to do it. So I was kind of doing it, but as a private hobby. It wasn't really looked at by the faculty. One or two faculty members looked at it. They knew I was working on it. But what was interesting was that they were very fine scholars and the leading people in the field. They knew Bloomfield very well, a personal friend. They were his students. But nobody ever mentioned to me that just a couple of years earlier, that Bloomfield had published something very much like this. And in fact, that it went back thousands of years. That I learned much later, part through Tom's work. Well, looking at neighboring fields back in the 50s, the main neighboring field was anthropology. In fact, linguistics was pretty much embedded in it. And Stanley Newman's comments were pretty typical. There was no cognitive science. It was barely in its infancy. George Miller was beginning to think about these things, but that was about it in the mid-50s. In fact, if you were a student in psychology at Harvard, as Eric Lenneberg, our friend, was, and you had three choices. You could study with, there were three professors. You could study with B.F. Skinner, who knew the truth about everything, and you had to take his courses. You could study with Smitty Stevens, who knew the truth about everything, but a different truth, and you could take his courses, and if you were the student of one of them, you couldn't take the courses of the other. And if you had some doubts and questions, you could study with George Miller, who was kind of eclectic and open-minded and willing to listen to other things. But that's pretty much the field. George himself had been a deeply committed radical behaviorist. You can tell that if you read his early book around 1950 on principles of psychology or something like that. But he was open-minded and was interested in other things and actually became, I suppose, the main founder of what became cognitive science. By the late 50s, there was the beginnings of work on sort of a systematic approach to language acquisition. Main work was Roger Brown. Roger Brown's, that's the Adam-Sarah material. He was, in the manner of the time, collecting data about Adam and Sarah, and valuable corpus. People use it all the time. But it's, again, important to remember how restricted the point of view was. We knew each other, we were friends, but one of the main discoveries about Adam and Sarah was that there's a period of what was called telegraphic speech, when the kids don't use function words, just use nouns and adjectives. So I suggested to him, it must have been around 1960, that he do a very simple experiment. And it was pretty obvious how it was going to turn out. Let the kid hear three different kinds of materials from his mother. So that his mother will talk to him in English, talk to him in telegraphic speech, and talk to him in telegraphic speech with the function words distributed randomly, and just see which ones he's going to understand. I mean, it wasn't pretty hard to figure out what would happen, but he wouldn't do it. and nobody would do it because that was interfering with the data. And you can't do that in this field. In this field, you take data and analyze it. In fact, it was a decade before the experiment was finally done by Lila Gleitman and some of her students, and of course it came out the way it's obviously going to come out, which meant something. It meant that when the kid was talking telegraphic speech, that what was going on in its head was a much richer language, and that's since become very important. The general sort of framework was behavioral sciences. The two questions were description and control of behavior. The standard text from the late 40s, 1948, when it was B.F. Skinner's William James lectures. 1948 came out about a decade later as verbal behavior. It was kind of the Bible in Cambridge. You know what that is. This control of behavior is the issue. He thought you could apply it to language. And it was very influential. Perhaps the most significant influence was on the philosopher who was the most influential philosopher of the day, certainly talked about these issues. That's W.V. Quine at Harvard. He was a fairly strict Skinnerian, not entirely. For him, this is 1960, a language is a complex of sentences associated with one another and with stimuli by the mechanism of conditioned response. That's a language. Like other serious people, Quine was schizophrenic on this, and elsewhere he recognized that somehow it's an infinite set, and he defined language as, this is now mid-60s, as a set of well-formed formulas, an equally obscure notion, I should say, but a set of well-formed formulas. And he argued that for linguists, it's folly to try to find what they believe to be the right grammar for that set of well-formed formulas. That would be like trying to find the right axiom system for the set of the theorems of arithmetic. There's no right axiom system. It's anyone. You pick the one that works for your whatever your considerations are. Well, that's well into the 1960s. It's the prevailing atmosphere for many years, and in some respects still is, though in somewhat different terms. I'll return to that. Well, the work in the early 50s that turned into the generative enterprise sort of began. It was just a couple of graduate students, actually, Morris, me, Eric Lenneberg, one or two others, who began to, at Harvard, who began to question the framework. Then we came here, and I think there were, in retrospect, there were two basic departures that were being explored. Didn't come into focus for a long time. The first was to try to take seriously the question, what is language? Not to be satisfied with the totality of expressions, whatever that's supposed to mean. Totality of expressions that can be expressed by a speaker. That doesn't mean anything if you think about it. Or, for that matter, the set of well-formed formulas, which is, if you're interested in metamathematics or formal language theory, you can talk about that set, but that's because you have an independent characterization of it. You have to have some finite characterization of it. For our purpose, it would be a grammar. So it's kind of backwards to say, even if you can give some sense to the notion of well-formed formula for language, which is, I think, very dubious, you have to have a finite characterization of it, a grammar, in other words, before you can even talk about it. So it doesn't make sense to say you have the set, then you try to find the grammar, and if you keep to proper methodology, there's no right one. None of those made any sense. At the very minimum, a language has to meet a classic description, a maxim of Aristotle's, that languages sound with meaning. Well, if languages sound with meaning, then there's three topics you have to study. The first one is sound, although as we now know, it's not necessarily sound. Work of the last couple of decades has shown that it can be sign. In fact, it can be touch. In fact, as far as we know, it can be any modality. But maybe smell isn't refined enough. But touch and sight certainly work. So it's some form of externalization. It's one thing to study. The other is meaning, with all of its many ramifications, and they're quite numerous. And the third, which has never really been a topic of study, is the notion with. What does it mean to have sound with meaning? It means there's got to be some way of associating them. And if you think about that, it's got to be a procedure of some kind, a finite procedure, generative procedure, which characterizes an infinite array, because of course it's unbounded, an infinite array of structured expressions, each of which has an interpretation in some form of externalization at the sensory motor level and within the system of thought, roughly speaking, called later the conceptual intentional level. So there's at least two interfaces, maybe only two, and the generative procedure has to characterize the infinite set of structured expressions. If there's a generative procedure, it's going to be structured. You can't get away from that. And which is interpreted at these interfaces. So at least it has to be that. It very quickly turned out, as soon as you get started trying to construct what that generative procedure might be, it very quickly turns out that everything is a puzzle. You don't understand anything. Quite different from everything being obvious, nothing is obvious at all. In fact, everything you look at is completely problematic. And that remains true, incidentally. You open a page of a book and try to think what the explanation is for those sentences. Way too hard a topic to study. And that was kind of surprising, very surprising, and very hard to get people to even think about. Still is in many ways. But shouldn't be problematic here. Essentially, everything is a puzzle, and the more you learn, the more puzzles there are. You think when you begin to understand something, new puzzles come into view, kind of like mountain climbing. You think you've climbed to that peak over there. When you get there, there's a bigger mountain behind you, which you hadn't thought about before. Well, that's normal science, but it was very foreign to the general conception of the behavioral sciences altogether. And remember, everything was in the behavioral sciences in those days: psychology, sociology, history, everything. Very foreign to that conception, and still is very much so. Well, some of these early puzzles are still very much on the research agenda, and still not completely understood by any means, in my opinion, at least. One of them, one of the earliest, it's familiar to you, so I won't go to the details, is the fact that the rules of language, when the issue arises, invariably keep to structural distance, not linear distance, which is pretty surprising, because linear distance is much more easily computable, obvious reasons, easier to parse, anything you can think of, but never used. You always keep the structural distance, minimal structural distance, in fact. That does raise questions, serious ones, still very much alive, like, for example, the question why. It can't be computational complexity, because that gives you the opposite answer. So it's got to be something else. And the most far-reaching answer, if you can maintain it, would be that at the point of mental processing where structures are generated and created and interpreted, there is no linear order. So you can't you can't use linear order because it's just not there. If that's true, it would mean that linear order is part of the externalization of language. It's part of the mapping of the internal system of computation and interpretation to one or another sensory modality. That's one of many reasons for believing that externalization is an ancillary part of language. That would include almost everything that people work on, phonology, morphology, it's all externalization. And it's the part of language that varies enormously from language to language, changes very quickly. It's the kind you have to study when you're learning a new language. You don't study the syntax and the semantics for one reason, because nobody can teach them to you since they don't know what they are. But it sort of leads to a picture of language which says there ought to be something internal which is just fixed. The generation of hierarchical structures, their interpretation at the conceptual intentional level, and then there's various ways of externalizing, which are secondary. It would incidentally follow that communication is even a more ancillary part of language. That's contrary to doctrines that go back centuries and are rarely questioned, but I think are inconsistent with what we know about language use, and even inconsistent with very little that we know about evolution of language. Well, there are arguments against this too. I mean, there's a lot of empirical work suggesting that, important empirical work suggesting that linear order and other forms of organization are part of the internal syntax. If it's true, it would be somewhat strange, in part because it doesn't seem to enter into the core semantic interpretation. So what's it doing there? It makes sense if it's in the externalization system, because the sensory motor system requires it differently for sign and sound, but requires some kind of organization. So it makes sense for it to be in the externalization, but there's empirical evidence that it isn't. Richie Kane's, as always, very stimulating work is maybe the most striking case. So you have the kind of problem you run into all the time. There's conceptual reasons for believing something. There's empirical evidence seems to indicate the opposite. So from there on, it depends on what your research intuitions are. Either you accept what looks like it's got to be right and try to figure out what's wrong with the empirical evidence or the interpretation of it, or you give up what seems to be obviously right. You pick your own way. But anyhow, it's a significant problem. If the principle can be maintained, maybe fully at best, or at least in some modulated form, it would add to the independent evidence. I think there's plenty that externalization is really a secondary aspect of language, not the core of language. Those are topics that are very much alive today. Well, along with the second departure from sort of the prevailing conceptions, along with the search for the study of, incidentally, this would mean, if it's correct, that the Aristotelian maxim has it backward. Language is not sound with meaning, but it's meaning with sound, which, if you think it through, has quite different implications, pretty far-reaching ones. But apart from the study of this, the moves towards inquiring to this topic, the other main departure back to the early 50s was to begin to think about language as a biological entity, that is, as the language of an individual, something like an individual's visual system, a real entity in the biological world. Later on, many years later, Massimo Piattelli called that the biolinguistic approach, the title he used for an important conference that was held here at MIT back in 1974, international conference, which he organized. According to this, if you think of language this way, it vastly enriches the array of data that you can bring to bear on what is a language. For example, language acquisition, processing, dissociations, a topic that Eric Lenneberg started to study seriously back in the early 50s and has become very important, and a lot more. It also follows from this point of view, even within linguistic research, narrowly, just language, that there is new evidence you can bring in. So, for example, if this is correct, then you can use evidence from Japanese in the study of English. There are reasons obvious, logic straightforward. In order to account for the phenomena of Japanese, you're going to have to postulate something about the genetic component for language, which maps the data onto what you see. And since that component is shared, very good evidence for that, it's going to tell you something about English. That conclusion, which is pretty standard by now among people who work in these areas, was very bitterly contested, still is bitterly contested. I got a sense of it a couple of weeks ago. I was in Australia, and there were Australian linguists, a lot of very good Australian linguists, many of them from here, working mostly on Aboriginal languages, and there was stuff going around the blogosphere among linguists about how this point of view denigrates the study of indigenous languages. You can kind of see the argument, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's nevertheless certainly a contested issue, though it shouldn't be. Well, these concerns, were of course by no means entirely new. Roman Jakobsen's Kindersprache is a famous example. But they did gain a lot more, they became much more centered, crucial to the core concerns of the study of the field if you move towards the generative enterprise. There was a shift through the 50s into the 60s from investigating procedures of analysis to investigating language acquisition. It's similar but different. And it was pretty slow, slower than it should have been, I think. So if you take something like my manuscript, Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory, LSLT, which incidentally was like anything else in this domain, completely unpublishable. At Roman Jakobsen's suggestion, I did submit it to MIT Press in 1955, 800 unintelligible pages that my wife and I ran off on a hectograph, if any of you remember that. Turns the whole room purple, But I did submit it, and they sent it to reviewers, and the reviewers rejected it with a pretty sensible comment, saying there isn't any such field, which was in fact true. There was no such field. As excerpts came out about 20 years later. By then, a field existed. This manuscript was kind of halfway between distributional procedural analysis and what became the biolinguistic enterprise. So to take just one example, which at that time seemed so totally trivial, I think it probably only had a footnote, but has become like a major topic in cognitive science today. It's the question of how you pick words out of a corpus. So there had been a proposal by Zellick-Harris that you can pick morphemes out of a corpus by looking at transitional probabilities. It's sort of plausible for an analytic language like English. Couldn't possibly work for inflectional languages. They don't have the kind of beads on a string property. But it could work for words, you might think, because words are basically kind of phonological units, so they could occur in sequence. Well, that was proposed as a possibility. But notice that, if it makes sense at all, in fact, it looked like the only possible way, so it was proposed as a kind of a necessity. That, within the framework of procedural analysis, that makes some sense, but not from the point of view of language acquisition. I mean, when a child doesn't pick words out of connected corpus. I mean, a child does hear connected speech, but it already knows words, and it picks out the words it knows. It uses prosodic information. I mean, nobody seriously believes that that's how children can learn language from connected speech. But from a procedural point of view, it made sense. I'll come back to its current status, which is interesting. That's segmentation. The other, notice that approach already violates the principle of no-level mixing, because morphemes you're getting words before you get morphemes, and that's inconsistent with going step by step, level by level. It's kind of like the writer-writer case, but it just seemed necessary. Seemed no other way to do it. So you're sort of beginning to find conflicts that later disappeared when the procedural approach was abandoned, as it should have been. There was also a problem of how to find categories of elements. So once you've got words, the next thing you want to do is find categories of words, then categories of phrases. There was an answer within the structuralist American or European tradition. You look at the distribution of the elements. So you take the word, say, young and old, you're studying English, you ask whether they have the same distribution. Do they appear in the same contexts? Well, of course, in a corpus, in a text, they don't. No matter how astronomical the text corpus is, they're going to be completely different, radically different. And if two things have even similar distributions, it'll be a kind of an accident. If you're talking about an elicited corpus, however, that makes some sense. You can elicit, you can carry out an effort with your informant to see whether these things are substitutable, even in structures that don't make any sense, but somehow work. So you can look at it that way, but from the point of view of analysis of a text, it doesn't mean anything. I'll come back to that because it's a hot topic today, but it's worth remembering it doesn't mean anything. And in fact, the proposals that were developed back in the early 50s, some of them are in LSLT, one of them found its way into an MIT math department thesis, were kind of global efforts, try to get a global system of categories which would, as a whole, best match the data. That's a feasible, it's not feasible, it's a rational approach, but even if to the extent that it works, it's unfeasible, it's computationally unfeasible, so it can't be a method of acquisition, and it isn't, of course. Another example of this kind of exploration was the first paper that Morris and I did together. It was a paper on stress patterns in English, 1956, I guess, for a Festschrift for Roman. And I don't recall how well we recognized this at the time, but the paper we got interested in it because of a kind of a brilliant insight of Morris's. I was a firm believer in the Traeger-Smith system, 9 stresses, 4 stresses, 4 pitches, annotate utterances. And Morris pointed out to me that Roman Jakobson makes every imaginable mistake in the phonetics of English, but he gets one thing right, the stress contours and the pitch contours. So there's got to be some principle there that accounts for them. And in fact, if you looked and you sort of violated the procedural principles, it turns out they're simple principles. You take a look at the syntactic structure, you get some simple rules that give you a fairly good account of it, and this is by now a big field. But at the time, it was totally inconsistent with every approach to language within the existing frameworks. Well, the biolinguistic perspective also began to focus attention on some facts which are elementary and should be noticed, and by now are, of course, quite important. And that is, and what they imply, one such fact is that human linguistic capacity appears to be uniform across the species. I mean, there are individual differences, but there are no known group differences. And so if you bring an infant from, Papua New Guinea tribe to Boston, it'll grow up like a kid here, and conversely. Doesn't seem to be any, maybe very marginal, but nothing much in the way of differences. It's uncontested, essentially, but it has consequences. It means there must be some, and of course no other organism can do anything, but it tells you there's some specific genetic endowment. Well, what can the factors be that enter into growth of language, acquisition of language? One could be properties that are specific to the language faculty, which something like that has to be true, if only because of the sharp difference between humans and other organisms. That's UG, linguistic theory, universal grammar in the modern sense, not the sense of the time. A second factor is other cognitive processes, which certainly exist. One that's looked at a lot now is statistical analysis. And a third factor is just laws of nature, which enter into growth and development all the time. They have to. Also into evolution, they set up a kind of channel within which changes can take place. Well, for a computational system like language, the obvious place to look is computational efficiency, and that's in one or another form been a leading concern since. I should say that there is a question about the balance and interaction of these. The contemporary cognitive sciences overwhelmingly assume that the only factor is the second one, other cognitive processes. A lot of work on that. There is work on interaction of universal. I think it's totally barren. Can't think of a single result, but it's pretty standard. There is work on the interaction of UG and cognitive processes, and that has some results. Yang's work is maybe the most far-reaching there that I know of, at least. But the main results, as far as I know, have come from looking at efforts to simplify the language, which means computational complexity, and I think that's had a number of results. Well, at least in principle, the biolinguistic perspective opens up the topic of the study of evolution of language. That began to be addressed in the 1970s at the conference I mentioned and elsewhere. Didn't really get anywhere. There has been in recent years an explosion of publications on cold evolution of language, but if you look at them closely, there are speculations about a different topic, evolution of communication. Quite a different topic, maybe a radically different one if I was right in what I said before. Evolution of language remains pretty much a mystery. There's a couple of things you can say about it. I don't have time now, but I think the few things you can say about it are with some interest. Well, throughout there's been one major problem. What exactly are the goals of generative grammar within the biolinguistic framework? As I said, these only came into view slowly, but one thing that came to be learned is that the topic wasn't really new. There is a tradition, goes back to classical Greece and India. It revived substantially in the 17th century. It kind of lingered on into the early 20th century, then kind of disappeared and had been forgotten. The last major linguist that I know of to talk about it was Otto Jespersen. As he described, I'll quote him, he said, the problem we have to face is the fact that in the mind of an individual speaker, there's a notion of structure that is definite enough to guide him in framing sentences of his own, crucially free expressions, typically new to the speaker and the hearer, and the grammar of a particular language then for a particular speaker would seek to capture this notion of structure to show how it yields the mechanisms to frame free expressions. And there's then a fundamental task, namely to not only to discover the grammars and the notion of structure, but also to find how they arise in the speaker's mind, language acquisition, and beyond that, to unearth the great principles underlying the grammars of all languages, that's what we would call UG, and not generalizations, but the genetic component, and by so doing, gain a deeper insight into the innermost nature of human language and of human thought. Now, those conceptions shouldn't sound very strange now, but at the time they were utterly remote from the reigning intellectual atmosphere of thought and inquiry, which was guided by the doctrines of behavioral science and by a rather dubious misinterpretation of logical positivism, which was quite influential. Well, the generative enterprise adopted all of this, gives you, without knowing it, just kind of reinvented it. It focused on the mind of the speaker, biological object, one which is internal to an individual, and where you look at it from a point of view that's intentional, that is, you care about the actual method of generation, not just some set of objects that might be generated. So capitalizing on the English words, it's been called I language. So that's what that's, I think, the right thing to look at. It's the object of inquiry. Now that's counterposed, and here I concede my guilt, to something that people call e-language. I invented the terms, so I guess I have some proprietary right to them. When I introduced the word e-language, I said it doesn't mean anything. E-language is just anything else. So if you want to think of language as a socio-cultural entity determined by colors on a map, like Chinese, okay, that's e-language. And anything else you might think of. If you want to think of it as a set of well-formed formulas, whatever that means, you can think of it that way. But it doesn't really mean anything. Unfortunately, the term has taken off, and it's now used in a way which I think is totally incomprehensible. It's used sometimes for a corpus, and sometimes for a set of well-formed formulas, a set of grammatical sentences. I have to confess some guilt. I don't think that means anything, either one, but I got to confess some guilt in that too. In syntactic structures, the first paragraph says we're going, for the moment, we'll consider a language to be a set of well-formed sentences, a set of grammatical sentences. And the reason for that is the next two pages later, it says it doesn't make any sense. There's no set of well-formed sentences. Everything, including word salad, has some interpretation. The grammar has to deal with that. But apparently almost nobody got past the first paragraph. So that phrase is common now all over the place. There's a reason for it. These were notes for an undergraduate course at MIT for mathematicians and engineers. So it started reasonably with what they knew something about, formal languages, logic, and so on. So we said, okay, we'll start thinking about a language as a formal language. And then it went on to try to show for the rest of the course and the rest of the book that this doesn't make any sense. But all that stuck was the first one, so we're there. Well, I won't, it's getting late, too late, so let me turn to throughout this period, a lot of developments, obviously, I won't run through them. One major shift, really striking shift, was the introduction of the principles and parameters approach around roughly 1980. Broadly speaking, there are three major approaches to language acquisition. One of them is roughly Percy and Charles Sanders Peirce's notion of abduction. You have some genetic factor, he called it an instinct, genetically determined, which puts limits on possible hypotheses. And then you somehow use data to pick something that fits within those limits. Well, he was considering scientific discovery, but there's something sounds similar in acquisition of language, radical differences, of course. So in acquisition of language, it's reflexive. It doesn't rely on the contributions of earlier generations. There's no instruction, very different from scientific discovery, but kind of abstractly looks sort of similar. Well, those were the early approaches to language acquisition. Universal grammar was supposed to give a format for grammars, I languages. Here's what they can look like. Then there's some evaluation procedure that selects among alternative choices, and you find the one that's most highly valued. Theoretically, that gives a discovery procedure, a way of finding a language from data. But of course, it's totally unfeasible. I mean, it takes astronomical search, so that can't be right. A second approach is to assume that there's just a finite set of choices. Well, some one or another variant of that is the principles and parameters model. A third approach, which is very common in the cognitive sciences, is to assume that there's no language at all, that it's very much like the 1950s. It's just what I already described. So there's no language at all, there's no such thing, just some collection of cognitive processes, and you just, nothing to find, so there's nothing to discuss, no puzzles, nothing else except getting the data. Well, as I say, I think that's been pretty barren, but let me make a couple of comments on it because it is important, if only because it's the dominant view in in computational cognitive science, at least, and much more generally. You can see that by reading the journals. And in fact, in the general scientific journals like Science and Nature and so on, it's very common. There's several, it's very much like the 50s. In fact, it's essentially returning to the atmosphere of the 50s that I described, actually regressing, I think. One is that one principle is that there are procedures of analysis. That's all there is. The second is essentially the Boasian perspective, or what was called that. Any amount of variation of languages is possible. And then come the procedures and their segmentation and classification. Just to give you a couple of examples, the most recent issue of Cognitive Science, October, Cognitive Science, the main journal of computational cognitive science, has an interesting paper. I'll quote from it, it asks, how many mechanisms are needed in order to acquire language from speech? Okay. And it says, well, obviously there's one mechanism that's been established. That mechanism is pure statistical analysis, Bayesian, et cetera. So there's pure statistical analysis. We know that that's a method. And the topic of the paper is what the authors call MOM, more than one method. Is there another method beyond pure statistical analysis? And then comes the paper. You can look at it and see what you think about it. I'm not interested in the paper, just the assumptions. The first assumption is you have to throw out, without comment, all the work that's been done on language acquisition, all of it, because that's not even an option. The only question is there something beyond pure statistical analysis? And then talk about some marginal thing. So you throw out all the work that's been done. The second is, what has been established about pure statistical analysis? Well, if you read the paper, it's conventional. It says what has been demonstrated by the Safran, Aslan, Newport study 10 years ago or so is that if you present infants with an artificial language, they can determine transitional probabilities, if simple enough language. And so can tamarins and so on and so forth. But what does that show, actually? Notice that that's the proposal of LSLT. At that point, it was considered so marginal you don't even talk about it. Now it's quite generally assumed to have established that you can throw out all of the study of language acquisition, which is essentially the assumption of the paper and the editors, obviously. Well, what does it show? First of all, that's not the way children acquire language. First of all, it doesn't show anything about acquisition of what you can do with a real text, what happens in a text of natural language. Well, it turns out it doesn't work. It's known that it doesn't work. Charles Yang showed years ago that if you apply this method, you essentially get syllables in English. If you add UG principles, like principles of prosody, like a word has a prosodic peak, then you get something closer to words. There's later work by Shukla, Aslan, and others, which says if you look at more complex prosody, like prosodic phrases, you get even a closer approximation. So first point about it is it doesn't work. Second point of it is it's not the way children pick out words. So in fact, it's zero. But this total failure is sufficient to throw out the whole theory of all the work that's been done on language acquisition. Fortunately, that's not so unusual. I'll mention one other case. What about classification? Well, there are proposals coming up, some of them pretty sophisticated. One of them is going to be the focus of a special session at the LSA in a couple of weeks, which tries to show that distributional methods of roughly the 50s variety can get you classification of words and phrases. Again, I won't talk about the details, but again, the assumptions. It's based on the notion of what's called a congruence class, a class of elements which share exactly the same distribution. And that gives you the answers. Well, exact same distribution in what? You know, it can't be an actual corpus of material, because there you're never going to get anything with the same distribution except by irrelevant accident. What is intended, apparently, is in what the author calls an E language. That is the full class of expressions. But that just begs the question. You don't have the full class of expressions until you've got the finite characterization of it, which is what you're trying to discover. So the same problem, which was well understood in the early 50s, and there were methods of getting around it, is now some of the most sophisticated work in the field. Let me say again that for practicing linguists of the 1950s, this was not a serious problem, because for them, a corpus meant something you elicit from an informant. So you explore and examine to see what words have roughly the same distribution. Well, of the three options, I think the only tenable one is some version of principles and parameters. I don't think the other two are even in the running. Well, right or wrong, it's been a highly successful research paradigm. It's led to explosion of work, very far-reaching work on a very wide variety of languages. You all know that. It also suggested a new research program, sometimes called Approaching UG from Below. That is, ask yourself the question, what would be the optimal answer to what an I language or theory of I languages ought to be, meeting the boundary conditions set by the interfaces. And if what I said before is right, only the conceptual intensional interface, not the other one. So what would be the best answer? And then look at materials, and when you find deviations from the best answer, which is just about everywhere, you ask yourself, can I account for the deviations, either by refining my notion of optimality, because it's not totally there's some obvious restrictions, but it's not totally a priori, or else by reanalyzing the data. Okay, that's a research program. Research programs can't be true or false. It's called the minimalist program, another bad terminological choice, because that makes it look as if it's something new. It's not anything new. First of all, it's just normal science. And secondly, it's kind of a seamless connection from the earliest work, getting rid of T markers, getting rid of phrase structure grammar, you know, on and on through the whole history. So it's just continuing. It's a research program, not true or false, not controversial, except maybe premature or something. And the only question about it is does it get anywhere? Well, I think it does, but I won't talk about that. Yeah. Well, I'll just end by reiterating two points that I made at the very beginning, which I think are worth keeping in mind. One point is that the kinds of questions that you're discussing today couldn't even be imagined 50 years ago, and that's a very sharp break in the history of linguistics. You go back millennia before that, and it's pretty much the same questions, not totally, but pretty much. That's significant. The second is, related to it, is that by now, just about everything is a problem. Nothing is obvious. At that time, not only were there no problems, but there couldn't be any. It was in principle impossible for there to be any more than superficial problems. I think that's a pretty welcome change. It has historical antecedents. It has some similarity to the early days of the modern scientific revolution. You go back to, say, the 17th century, Galileo and others began to be puzzled, allow themselves to be puzzled at things which had been taken for granted for millennia. So, for example, why does a rock fall and steam rise? Aristotle explained it, they're going to their natural place, end of that story. And that was accepted for millennia as an explanation. As soon as you begin to ask questions about it, everything immediately falls apart. Turns out all your intuitions are wrong about the rate of fall, everything else, and you get modern science. And I think there's a lesson there, one that we should have been learning, and that is it's very important to allow oneself to be puzzled by what seems on the surface to be obvious, and that can turn out to be quite illuminating, as I think we've learned in the last 50 years. Thanks.
Microphone circulating, just raise your hand.
I was thinking about what you were saying about the early 50s, and I remember an article by Bar Hillel in which he criticizes distributional approaches to syntax because they don't take into account Ajdukevich's. Am I talking too softly? I was thinking about the article by Bar Hillel in the early 50s in Language, in which he criticizes Zelig Harris's distributional approaches to syntax because they don't take into account meaning or Ajdukievich-style logic. And this seems very different from the account that you give of what American linguists were doing in the 50s. And I wondered what you thought what were other linguists' response to what Bar Hillel said at the time, and what was your response at that point?
Well, I had an article about it, so you can see my response. But Bar Hillel was a close friend, actually. He was one of the few people who was starting off this generative enterprise. In fact, he was actually the only person to have read my own paper on generative grammar, the Morphonemics paper back in the 1940s. He read it, had some very good ideas, and the version that finally appeared 20 years later, I mentioned that his ideas were significant in changing it in an important direction. So we were very close. We disagreed about millions of things, but we were very close in trying to work out these topics. I was asked by Zelig Harris to write a response to it. He didn't want to do it, so I agreed to write a response to it. And there were things that I thought were wrong. I think he was much too rigid in his interpretation of... There was a big debate going on at the time about meaning between Carnap and Quine, and I kind of gave some of the Quinean responses to what were taken to be Carnap's views on the nature of meaning. I thought couldn't use them this way, and things like that. Basically, we were, as far as the Ajdukievich approach was concerned, which later turned into categorical grammar, it's a possibility. I don't think it's a good approach to iLanguage, but it is a possibility that you can try. Many people think it's important. So that was the nature of the discussion. I don't think anybody else ever looked at it, frankly. Not that I can recall. Yeah.
Hello. There were a series of talks this morning about evaluation metrics, and they were excellent. I really lit up by them. But most of the evaluation metrics were sort of deductive things that would measure the length of grammars or the efficiency on some logarithmic scale. But what you mentioned was very interesting about Charles Sanders Peirce, because a lot of the value of a scientific theory is not that it's successful, but that it fails in an extremely interesting way. And by the failure, one can actually guess what might be the next step. Here I think of the invention of case theory, for instance, because the grammar failed in an interesting way up to that point. But I think, do you think it's possible to have an objective measure of how a grammar fails and how it might lead to new concepts of grammar?
Can't do it for physics. If you can't do it for physics, you can't do it for linguistics. That's kind of a theorem, you know. There's no measure of when a theory fails. So like say...
Not so much when it fails, but why it fails.
What?
No, why it fails.
Yeah, well, I mean, take contemporary physical theory, what you learn if you take a physics course at MIT. You learn modern physics, which has a slight problem. It can't find 90% of the mass energy in the universe. Well, you know, kind of minor problem. In fact, the CERN accelerator, you know, is now trying to find the famous Higgs bosons, which, if they exist, will maybe overcome this problem. Well, that's the state of science. Most things it doesn't understand, you know. You have theories which, it's a terrific theory, works, you know, better than anything in history, but it has defects like this. Also, it doesn't know how many universes there are. Are there one or an infinite number? That's a live question. But you can't, and it's an open question. And there's just no way of measuring the extent to which a theory succeeds in answering the questions that it poses. Because they all, I mean, if you take a look at data, they all fail wildly. That's why scientists do experiments. You know, you do experiments to try, experiment creates an idealization, a highly idealized system in which you try to get an answer to something, but you don't try to get an answer to what's going on in the world. You know, that's way too complex, far too many variables, and so on. In fact, this is part of where the Galilean revolution kind of took off. Galileo was doing experiments. Most of them were thought experiments. He didn't actually do them, just kind of thought about them. And a lot of them are physically impossible, it's now known. But he tried to convince the NSF of his day, the aristocrats, that the results that he was getting meant something. And if you look back at the discussions, they couldn't see the point of what he was doing. I mean, why worry about a ball rolling down a frictionless plane, which can't even exist, instead of, say, worrying about how a flower grows? To try to get over that gap was no small task. And in fact, Galileo faced plenty of problems, like he was never able to explain why objects don't fly off the Earth. If the Earth is rotating, why don't we all fly off it? Well, small problem. The people didn't give up science at that point. They kind of went on. So yeah, you expect theories to fail, and it's interesting to learn where they fail. And yes, you try, just like you said, you look at the failures and try to see if you can overcome them, often by just trying to find real data, you know, not the data of sense, which is way too complex to look at, but the kind of data which will be designed to give you the right answer. And this is everywhere. I mean, take, say, Newton. It was not a fool exactly, but Newton still assumed that water contains earth. Remember, there were 4 major elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And it was assumed 17th, 18th century, 16th, 17th century, that water contained earth. And there were good reasons for it. I won't go into the details, but the kind of experiments they did, no matter how much you refined water, it always had earth in it. Okay, you got better experiments, and turned out there's an answer to that. But the point is, there's never almost never an evaluation procedure. The evaluation procedures within linguistics were of a different nature, totally different. They presupposed a set of possible theories. So they presupposed a kind of a Peircean approach. You presuppose a limit on possible hypotheses. You say, here are the possible theories. You know, grammar of whatever type, say maybe the aspects type. And you have, or say the SPE theory. And then you construct an evaluation procedure, which is in fact an empirical hypothesis. So take, say, SPE, where it's worked out in some detail for phonology, more phonemics and phonology, sound pattern of English. There is an evaluation procedure, which essentially is a method for mapping a grammar of the permitted form into a number. Because if you get things into numbers, you can rank them, you know, bigger or smaller. But the way the evaluation procedure works is by proposing a concept of legitimate generalization. So here's a linguistically legitimate generalization. And then comes a notation which allows that generalization to map into a shorter grammar. Okay, so you get an evaluation procedure, but it's an empirical hypothesis. It's just part of it's just as empirical as the assumptions about the nature of the theory. And that's quite different from a general evaluation procedure for science that would tell you how good a theory is, which is just beyond any hope. You know.
It's a sort of a question about probably language acquisition. If you're assuming that universal grammar is just merge,
It's just
merge,
can't hear
combinatorics.
merge. Oh, yeah.
Does this mean that language acquisition would be guided by general cognitive principles?
Well, if you let's go back to what's called the minimalist program, research program. We want to find a system which will be as perfect as possible, meeting the boundary conditions. It's a digital infinite system. That's not in question. Every digital infinite system is going to be characterized by some finite procedure, if you can at least even proceed to talk about it. You take a careful look at those finite procedures, all of them have buried in them somewhere an elementary combinatorial operation which says take two things already constructed and make a bigger thing. Okay. They may not put it that way, like it might look like an axiom system or a system of constraints or something, but in there somewhere there's going to be that operation. You have to put things together to get bigger things, otherwise you don't get digital infinity. Well, suppose you assume that operation is computationally perfect, so it is as simple as possible. Now, we don't understand everything about computational efficiency, but some things are obvious, like less is better than more, simple things like that. A computationally perfect compositional operation will, first of all, not involve order, because it's simpler not to have order. So it'll create a set, not an ordered pair. And furthermore, it'll meet what is sometimes called a no tampering condition. It won't, if it takes X and Y and wants to make a bigger thing out of them, it won't modify either X or Y, simply because less is better than more. So that's merge. Merge says it's the optimal compositional operation, which is going to be somewhere in there. Maybe it'll be a lot more complex than that if we're out of luck, but if we're in luck, that'll be it. Okay, suppose it, and I think there's some evolutionary reasons and others to think that something like that's true. Well, of course, if you try to apply that theory, you're finding yourself in the situation of science generally. Everything seems to refute it. So what you do is, if you want to pursue this research program, you ask yourself, where does it appear to fail? And then you ask, can I refine the concept of optimality, or can I reinterpret the data so that it doesn't fail for a significant aspect of the data? Well, we don't know. That's the strong minimalist thesis, so-called, is the thesis says maybe it works. How close can you come to that? Well, that's a matter of experiment. Suppose you could come perfectly to it. Then what would be involved in language acquisition? Well, basically this, a computational principle, general computational principles, which would be maybe organism independent, certainly language independent, and it would be the case that the application of these principles with some form of, more than this, clearly, because there are other things that have to be accounted for. Like one thing that has to be accounted for is sort of completely obvious, but I think you can tell me, as far as I know, it's never even been studied. How does an infant select out of the data of the environment, you know, the famous blooming, buzzing confusion? How does it select data that are language related? It's quite a trick if you think about it. We know that no other organism does it, and it's not because of defects of the auditory system. So it's been discovered recently that chimpanzee auditory systems are very similar to human. They even pick out things like distinctive features. So it's not that. It can't be the lack of output mechanisms, as was thought at one time, because humans can use anything. They can use speech, they can use sign, they can use touch, anything. And other organisms have that. So there's some internal computational element that's allowing an infant to extract this kind of data. There's something known about it. Prosodic information rhythmic information seems significant, but other organisms pick out rhythm. So something's going on, and that's not merge. Okay, and then it goes on. You know, there's going to be other things that come along when you really look at the problem. But that's the empirical problem of language acquisition studies. It's going to have at least this. In fact, any approach is going to have at least this. And the question is, does it have at most that?
Yeah, I'm going to reminisce a little bit since we're in a reunion. First, I'm going to jump to something. I remember Morris one time in a phonology class going on and on about the heart of periodicity at the core of language and rhythm. And I can remember Morris in a phonology class once just going off on periodicity being at the heart of language. And I think I'd argue it's not that other animals have rhythm or have periodicity. They're not drawn to it in the way that we are to sort of trigger a system.
Well, there is, I'm sure you know this, but there is by now pretty good evidence that children can pick out prosodic structure very quickly. In fact, prenatally. So Jacques Miller's work and subsequent work showed that newborn infants can distinguish the language of their mother from some other language spoken by a bilingual woman, which they've never heard, immediately, you know, as soon as you can do experiments. This, of course, set off a raft of experimentation, and by now it's been shown that, of course, it's not any two languages, depends on the properties, and it seems to fall into patterns of similar prosody. So it seems that infants are just tuned to picking out prosodic elements. There is work, I think, mainly by, some of you know a lot more about this than I do, so correct me, but the most that I know is by Laura Ann Petito, finding special structures in the brain, which apparently she claims are humanly specific, that pick out certain kinds of rhythm roughly at the level, roughly at the size of a syllable. So maybe kids are picking out something like syllables. And then it's again, you know, by say 6 months or so, I think kids pretty much have mastered the prosodic structure of their language. So something's going on very fast, you know, obviously pre-tuned, but it's more than just prosody and periodicity. It's of a specific kind. It's of a kind that's looking in specific ways and is using that information to construct everything we know. And in fact, what I said about telegraphic speech is quite relevant here, I think. The better experimentation has become, the more it's been learned that the younger and younger you get, the more that kids know. And there is evidence by now that, you know, by roughly maybe 18, 20 months, the kids probably know almost the whole language. One kind of evidence for this is the Helen Keller type case. Helen Keller was extremely fluent, you know, wonderful fluency. She was blind deaf, but I think she became blind deaf at 20 months. She invented for herself, it turns out, Lila Gleitman pointed this out to me recently with some old videotapes that surfaced. She had worked out the system that's now called Tadoma, which is used to teach blind deaf. It's a system where you put your hand on the cheek and your thumb on the vocal cords, and she somehow figured that out. And her almost remarkable fluency in English came from something like Tadoma, but from 20 months. Now, since then, there's been experimentation, some of it here. My wife did a lot of the main work on this, that studied other cases experimentally, and they never published this because there weren't enough cases. But what was coming out was that they could get very successful results with Tadoma if the person lost sight and hearing roughly at that age. But if it was before about 16 months, they never had any success. Well, if that holds up, fortunately you can't study it anymore because this was spinal meningitis, and now it's curable. But if some result like that turned out to be right, it would imply that roughly at that age, the kids must know an awful lot about the language, and that Tadoma is just kind of eliciting something that's inside, sort of like the telegraphic speech story.
The question I wanted to ask is a very quick one. Can you hear me? The question that I wanted to ask, which was a quick one, was being around the department in the 1970s, I think we all share the experience that you never know who was going to show up on what day and what conversation you were going to hear walking down the hall. And one of the memories that I have is a conversation between you and Thomas Kuhn, where he said, well, there was a scientific revolution in linguistics. And you poo-pooed it and said, no, you're really missing the point. I'm just curious whether you've changed your mind, because as I listened to what happened from 1950 to...
well, Tom, I don't remember that conversation, of course, but Tom was a friend. We often talked about this, and my feeling was that he was finding too many scientific revolutions. But and in the case, other people picked it up, and it became a joke after a while. Every new experiment, there was a scientific revolution. But the real scientific revolutions, the ones that are serious, like the Galilean revolution, the main one he studied, or relativity, quantum theory, a couple of them, they were major events in intellectual history. My feeling about linguistics then and still is that we're in a kind of a pre-Galilean stage. Maybe there'll come a scientific revolution, but I think we're kind of struggling towards it. I can see some of the things that might fall together, but I wouldn't exaggerate.
We have time for one more question. There was a question over there before. Mark, yeah.
I don't know if this is worth closing on, but I have the microphone. So one of the current trends that concerns me personally the most that you were talking about is the idea now that you should study a language out of a corpus, not out of elicited material. And I had sort of thought that that was a regression to the bad old days. One of the things that I learned from your talk is, in fact, they had a different notion of corpus that was much more workable, where it was the material that you had elicited.
Absolutely.
I can sort of imagine in the Mohawk language that you could get the 58 verb forms out of a corpus, but it would have to be a huge corpus, and that's just the 58 prefixes. And I sort of think that that's, well, I don't know whether they're trying to make work on interesting range of languages impossible, or if there's a kind of this kind of schizophrenia that you talked about where they don't really do that. I mean, you could probably study a corpus for 3 months and get that, but you could elicit them in a half an hour, and why not? But then I was sort of curious about whether there were any controversies about what was a corpus back in those days that would be instructive for these issues now.
I really don't think so. I mean, when I was a student, I was a student in the 40s, Zelig Harris and people. Being a student meant you took courses in field methods, in which you studied how to, elicitation procedures, they were called. How do you deal with an informant to try to get relevant information from him? And then you studied methods, and that was it. The field was over. In fact, Harris himself by the late 40s, and you can tell this from the publications, thought that linguistics was finished. That's why by the late 40s he was starting to do discourse analysis. And in fact, most of our courses when we were students, grad students, was in discourse analysis. Since linguistics was essentially finished, theoretically at least, there's a lot of work to be done yet, you might have better go on to something else, like techniques of abstracting for scientific journals and so on, which is his early 50s articles. But I don't think that this idea of, there were people who felt, well, yes, we can do it all by analyzing a corpus, like this unnamed linguist who I mentioned, famous American Indianist, you know him, who said he's not going to collect any material anymore, he's just going to collect data because computers are around and we'll program them, it's all over. That was certainly not the position of the working linguist. The working linguist went out into the field, got an informant, tried to elicit data, asked more questions, and that way you sort of built up something that you could do. In fact, I frankly, just personally, I didn't even see a lot of point in that. Like the first, just personally, personal thing. In 1947, I guess, I had to do an undergraduate thesis. I was getting my undergraduate degree, and Harris suggested that I do a structural analysis of Hebrew, which I sort of knew, not like a native, but I knew the language pretty well. And so I started on informant techniques. I got an Israeli informant. I went through all the routine. After a month or two, I realized this is totally absurd. Anything I'm interested in, I know already. And the stuff I'm learning from him, like the phonetics, I don't care about. So I stopped and then just started on this personal hobby of writing a generative grammar. But yeah, if you want to study a language you don't know, like Mohawk, you're just going to have to do it by informant work. It's just like scientists have to do experiments. Like you couldn't do physics by taking videotapes of what's happening outside the window and doing a complex statistical analysis. And if you did that, you'd get a pretty good prediction of what might happen next outside the window. It's certainly better than anything the physics department could give. But there's no point. Science isn't done that way. And this is an existing tendency, which I think is actually, as you put it, a regression from the days when I was a student in the 40s. It's worse than that. And you're just never going to get anything this way. You can't, I mean, you can get approximations to data. And there's nothing wrong with Bayesian statistics, which is a hot term these days, fine to do. But the point of doing a Bayesian statistical analysis of data is to see if the prior assumptions make any sense. If something's working out, then you say, okay, what were my prior assumptions? I'll take a look at those. But you can fit just about any data by making the right prior assumptions. Actually, a recent issue of Brain and Behavioral Sciences, which you may have seen, is devoted to Bayesian analysis. And a very good philosopher of science, what the heck's his name, forgotten, pointed out that you can always succeed. Virtually any data can be approximated by the right priors and so on. So if you want to match data, it's a good way to match data. But you'll only learn something from it if the matching of data leads you to inquire into the basic assumptions that you made and see, well, what's making us match the data? And if you don't bother with that, then it's basically a waste of time, I think.
Don't leave yet. No. Just sit down. I'll tell them what. Oh, okay. So while Morris pours the water, if you could just have. Thank you. So as you know, there is a reception. Are you going to sit down? As you know, there's a reception for the reunion people, the registered participants, on the 8th and 9th floor. We have both spaces, so you can move around. But I wanted to do something else before we all go upstairs. Now, in the 1950s, Noam visited Morris in Maine. Morris had and still has a house there. And they went for a walk, and Morris's wife, Roz, took a picture of the two of them. And in 1988, which was quite a few years ago, I was in my second year then, we had a party for Noam's 60th birthday in the department. And at that party, Morris presented Noam with a huge enlargement of that picture that had been taken more than 30 years before that. Now, I had said I was in my second year then, and I took a picture of them holding that picture. And the enlargement of that picture is this. I don't know why you're applauding, but all right. Okay, so if you're like me and you're looking for a good photo op, get out your cameras and your phones, because Noam and Morris have agreed to pose for the third recursion of this picture. So if you come here. So take down, if you want, take down your cameras and come down here. Or unless you have good... You can come closer, it's okay.
If you bother looking at the picture, you'll get a little bit of social history. Sabine didn't mention, but the first picture in 1955 was on a Sunday afternoon. Morris was up at his summer place, and I went to visit them on a Sunday afternoon. I don't know if you can see, but we're both wearing jackets and ties. It's Sunday afternoon at the beach. That was the mid-1950s.